that at the moment.
Hello and welcome to Polar Bears International Tundra Connections webcast. We are live right now on Tundra Buggy 1 near Churchill, Canada, with polar bears and other wildlife right outside our windows. Today we're talking about studying polar bears, and our target audience is grade 6+. But this won't deter my daughter's 4th grade class in New York from watching. So hello to everyone there, and hello to everyone else in New York who's tuning in live, and everyone around the world. This program will last for about 35 to 45 minutes, including time for questions and answers at the end. So if you're watching the broadcast and you want to ask a question, right on your screen, you could submit to one of our panelists in the chat window. If you don't have access to the chat window, you could even send a question directly to questions@pbears.org. My name is Justin Fornell. I'm the host of the Science Channel show Unexplained and Unexplored. I'm also very proud to call myself a Polar Bear International Ambassador. And joining me today are 3 of the world's top polar bear experts, Jeff, Megan, and Andy. And please, I'll allow you guys to give a little bit more of a detailed introduction about your expertise.
Sure. Well, my name is Megan Owen, and I'm a conservation biologist at the Institute for Conservation Research at the San Diego Zoo.
Great.
Hi, my name's Jeff York, and I'm the Senior Director of Conservation for Polar Bears International.
And I'm Andy DeRoche. I'm a professor of biological sciences at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. I've been studying polar bears across the Arctic for over 35 years.
So as you can see, we have an amazing team, and I know that our viewers have a lot of questions for you. But really, I think the first question is, this is my first time in Churchill, and I've known you guys for a while, but to actually be here physically in this almost like a lunar rover out in this vast expanse of whiteness, I think people really have no concept of where we are. Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about where we are right now on this planet?
Sure. So we are located about 15 kilometers east of Churchill, Manitoba, on the shores of Hudson Bay. Even though we're on a body of water that's oceanic and saltwater, we're in the middle of Canada. So the weather here is quite continental. Churchill gets very cold temperatures in the winter, and we're technically in the subarctic, but I would say the conditions are right on the edge of Arctic. And you can also see when we pan out on some of the camera views, we're at the edge of the boreal forest. You might see trees in the distance, although we're losing visibility with some snow here right now. And you can just see low vegetation. And as we go further up the bay, that vegetation just drops down to tundra very quickly.
Yeah. And how are we navigating this vast expanse? What is this vehicle, this Tundra Buggy, for those who have never seen one before?
Sure. So we are on what we call Buggy 1. Buggy 1 is very graciously donated to us by Frontiers North Adventures. They only have a limited number of permits to be out here. They give us one of those for this outreach and for the science work that we do. These are raised platform vehicles, so they're taller than the bears are when they stand up, and they keep people safe from the bears we're trying to view.
Wow, that's amazing. So, in polar bears, that's really what we're here talking about today. Andy, I've really been enjoying your book. It's kind of easy to get into and just learn all about these beautiful creatures. But for our viewers out around the world, tell us a little bit about Polar Bear 101.
Well, it's a species that really evolved to live on the sea ice. That's where the bears want to be. Now we're seeing them right now. It's basically like they're on holidays. There's nothing to eat here. There's no mating activity. So they're just waiting for the bay to freeze again. And then what's going to happen is they're going to migrate out onto Hudson Bay, and they're going to start hunting seals. Mm-hmm. So the main prey of polar bears are ring seals. They're very abundant. They're kind of what I call the small meal deal. And they're up to about 70 kilograms or 150 pounds. And then there's the bearded seals, which is the big meal deal, and they're up over 400 kilos, which puts you well above 800 pounds. So they're going to spend the winter hunting. It's not the best hunting conditions now, but they're really trying to get enough energy to just sort of hold stable until the spring, and then they're going to eat an incredible amount. And the reason is because the seals are going to be having their pups at that time, and they're much more vulnerable to predation. And so then the bears bulk up in the spring, and then they use that energy for this on-land period and lose somewhere around 1 kilogram or 2 pounds of body weight per day that they're on shore. And right now, these bears have been on land for over 140 days, and most of these bears haven't eaten anything over that period.
Wow. And now when they do get these seals, are they eating the entire animal, nose to tail essentially?
No. This is a really cool thing. I mean, it's what I call polar bears. They're almost like a fat vacuum. That's the way to think of them. They just go around, they kill the seal, and then they peel them open. And I use lots of descriptors. It's like if it's a bearded seal, it's like I call them a banana seal because they rip them open and they just peel back the skin, and the skin is really thick, and then they scrape out that blubber layer, and it's pretty impressive. I mean, they can eat about 10 to 20% of their body weight in a single meal. So if you're a polar bear, you don't have to eat very often, but when you do eat, you have this massive dietary intake, and that's really what makes being a bear possible.
Wow. And I know we've been watching bears all morning. One thing I noticed was they just keep licking the air. Are they smelling? Are they gathering data?
Yeah, I more or less they just get their. I mean, a bear lives by its nose. I mean, that's really the primary sense that they're working with. They use it for finding their prey. I mean, they have pretty good eyesight. I mean, probably about the same as a dog. They're certainly better at night than we are. We have what's a word is called trichromatic vision. So, but they have what's called dichromatic, and what they're missing is they don't see green very much. So it's a different sort of eyesight than we have, but they're certainly adapted to dealing with Arctic conditions. I mean, where they live most of the year, there's not much green anyways.
Got it. So, but if we do end up off the tundra buggy, perhaps we should just wear a green smock and hide in the snow.
I don't think I'd try that. Definitely not.
Now, Jeff, why are polar bears so hard to study?
Polar bears are hard to study because of where they live. So historically, most polar bears lived on the sea ice, and many of those bears year-round. They didn't interact with people, and they didn't come to shore, or didn't spend much time ashore there. So being in the far north, being this remote, is quite expensive logistically, and that varies wildly depending on where. Churchill, where we are, is actually one of the cheapest places in the world to study polar bears because there's a rail line that comes here. There are helicopters that are often based here, and in an Arctic sense, we're relatively far south. The cost of capture and working on bears goes up exponentially as you go into the Canadian high Arctic and to places like Russia.
Wow, that's amazing. And so, I mean, Megan, why can't we get all of our questions answered about these polar bears? I mean, it seems like there's some great scientists out there doing so much work for decades now.
Yeah, that's a great question. So despite just really almost heroic efforts to study polar bears, as Jeff mentioned, they live out on the sea ice. That's a frozen Arctic Ocean. So it's extraordinarily difficult to follow them or to collect samples from them. And there are many scientific questions where we want to be able to follow an individual through time, or we want to be able to really closely observe them or measure different aspects of their biology. So sometimes when we identify a scientific question that we want to address, we'll work with zoos or bears in zoos so that we can measure certain parts of their biology up close and personal. Then we try to extrapolate or just sort of extend those findings to wild bears. And so, you know, as many of you may know, polar bears are under tremendous pressure from climate change, and we're very concerned about whether they'll survive as a species. So we're all working together. So scientists that work in the field, scientists that work in zoos, we're working together to address questions to help understand polar bears so we can better protect them. So we'll take information wherever we can get it.
Wow, so there is actually fantastic reasons other than for people to get up close and personal and fall in love with these animals for polar bears being kept in zoos.
So yeah, polar bears in zoos in many ways serve as ambassadors for their wild counterparts. People can come to zoos and see polar bears and get an understanding of their size and their needs and their personalities. And all of that's great for connecting with polar bears. Zoos also have an opportunity to teach the people that come into zoos all about their biology, all about the threats to their survival. And additionally, we work to study them. So we're trying to do everything we possibly can to help polar bears.
Got it. And in regards to some of this work being done with captive bears to help wild bears, Jeff, can you tell me a little bit about these adhesive tag studies?
Sure. So it's a great example of, you know, exactly what Megan was talking about, combining these two worlds, bringing them together. We've struggled in the polar bear world to come up with a tag that is universally applicable for males, females, subadults, and even cubs, something that would work across those age groups and age classes there. And so we finally turned to a large corporate engineering firm, 3M, who makes things that stick. You know, with adhesives, they make things that stick with Velcro-like substances, and now we've challenged them to make things that would stick better to a polar bear. To test those tags, we'll first go to our captive zoo partners to see how these do in the short term on bears in a controlled setting. Once we have dialed that in, then we can take that tag out and put it in the wild.
Wow.
But by then we'll know we have something that's worth, the cost of putting out.
So the MO is constantly evolving and changing with new science as it's happening daily.
Absolutely, evolving to do things better, to get more accurate data, to work with bears in ways that are less invasive.
Wow. Now I also understand we're doing treadmill studies with bears that are at zoos.
Yeah, so this is a very exciting line of research we've been working on. And the idea here is to just understand the amount of energy a polar bear needs to put out to move about its Arctic habitat. And so to do this, we actually trained polar bears to voluntarily work with us, and they actually were trained to walk on a treadmill. And so if you ever see a commercial for Gatorade or something like that, and they'll have an athlete that has their oxygen consumption and their CO2 output being measured as they move. And we did this with polar bears. And again, this was a highly collaborative study. And we really developed some really new insights into the amount of energy a polar bear needs to survive. And it turned out they actually used more energy than we had anticipated.
Wow.
And so with this, we were able to measure the amount of energy they consume just while they're resting, and while they're walking at a slow pace, while they're walking at a brisk pace, and even swimming, if you can imagine that.
Yeah. I assume this is a very special treadmill.
It's a very special treadmill. It's the biggest treadmill you'll ever see.
That's amazing.
Yes.
That's where I'll go right after New Year's. That's when I'll start on and then work down to the normal one.
We'll get it ready for you.
Now, why is this work so valuable, guys? I know we touched on that a little bit, but...
Well, the way polar bears are making a living is changing. And trying to understand how they're responding is one of the most important things that we can do from a conservation and management perspective. And, if you don't know what's happening to the bears, it's very hard to manage them or try to put up effective conservation measures in place. So there's a role for science to play that integrates with the managers who are responsible for these populations and trying to come up with solutions that work. And so it's part of sort of understanding, and polar bears are really an early indicator of change in these ecosystems. So what happens to polar bears is going to happen in different ways to other species as well. And so if we can alert people to the challenges that polar bears are facing, then we have a better chance of trying to preserve a lot of different species that live in these high latitude areas. So a lot of the challenges that polar bears face will be the same thing for narwhal and walrus and ring seals and bearded seals, all these very what we call ice specialists or ice dependent species. They rely on the presence of sea ice for completing various aspects of their life history. So we can learn a lot about polar bears, and we know a lot about them, and so we can make some very insightful predictions about what will happen as the sea ice disappears. And then we can apply what we learn on polar bears to other species as well.
Wow. And I know one thing that's come up the more I talk to you guys about your work in the field is just the usage of collars, and particularly now these video camera collars. How have they changed, and what are they being used for right now?
Well, collars have been used for a long time. And basically the idea is that we want to be able to follow these animals that move over really vast distances. And so the collar, fundamentally provides us the location and movement tracks of wildlife. In recent years, different sensors have been put on those collars. So if you have a smartphone, right, that smartphone has a range of sensors on it that allow it to track where you are, how quickly you're moving, all sorts of other things. And so for polar bears, we put on accelerometers, which is like a Fitbit, so it tracks the basics of behavior. We have conductivity sensors, which can tell us whether they're in the seawater or out of the seawater. There's light sensors, which can tell us whether a female is in the den or whether she's come out of the den. And with all of this information, we can remotely tell a bit more about polar bear behavior. But we'd really like to move beyond the collar and then move to something smaller. And so there's been all sorts of new developments in tagging technology.
Wow. Yeah, one of our questions was just saying, one of our questions that was sent in live is, what information have you received from tracking the polar bears, and how has that enabled you to help these bears within the bigger picture?
Sure, tracking information, or what we would call movements information, is critical to a number of questions. It helps managers establish or confirm home ranges for areas where polar bears are still harvested, which is very important. It is critical to developing accurate measures of abundance in these same populations. So when people ask how many polar bears there are, having movements data to go along with other metrics is very important. It helps us understand, as Andy mentioned, how bears are not only using their habitat, but how those movements and how that use might be changing over time. So a number of places where movements data is absolutely critical.
Great. And who could tell me a little bit about this AAC network and what it is and how it's also helping kind of the bigger picture?
Sure,
Why
back
don't you
to
go
me.
ahead, Jeff?
Wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, the AAC stands for Arctic Ambassador Center, and they're the designated zoos and aquariums in North America and Europe that have met certain criteria to be sort of PBI ambassadors on polar bears. So these are institutions who maintain a certain level of care for the animals, institutions that have committed to training their staff, interpretive staff in particular, on messaging, so they have accurate science on polar bears and polar bear conservation and on climate.
Got it. And another live question coming in. With the changing environment, with the changing habitat, have you seen other Arctic animals being affected?
Well, definitely. I mean, we have pretty good indications that the ring seals, so this is the small meal deal for polar bears, that their populations are struggling. We have seen a lot of other Arctic whales starting to change their distribution and migration patterns. So we are seeing that, and interestingly, I mean, if we do lose sea ice in the Arctic, I mean, there's other species that will come in. And one of the top predators that will likely move into this part of the world is the killer whale. And in this part of Canada, we are seeing a dramatic increase in the number of killer whale sightings. So they never historically would come far into Hudson Bay. It's too dangerous. They've got that big dorsal fin on their back, and they're not an ice-adapted species. So they would always come into the fringe, and of course all these other Arctic species are hiding in the ice to stay away from them. But now that the ice is melting, we're seeing these changes and new species coming in. And we're seeing this with all sorts of things coming into the Arctic. And it's not just big mammals. We see it with birds, we see it with insects, and we're seeing it with a lot of fish species. So both species from the Atlantic and Pacific moving into the Arctic to fill up this space as the sea ice disappears. So it's not like there's going to be a void here. It just will be a different ecosystem, and if we don't do something about climate change, it won't include polar bears in this part of the world.
Got it. And you guys you've really dedicated your careers not only to the study of polar bears, but helping these animals. What are some of the questions you guys still have? I mean, because if there's questions you have, those are the ones that you're most likely going to be the ones to find out the answers for all of us.
I think one of the questions that I find really interesting, and I would love to see developments towards being able to study mothers in their dens. So polar bear mothers, like other bears, they den up when they're pregnant, and that's where they stay for several months and give birth to and raise their very young cubs. And because polar bears, they den in snow, there's no sign of that den, and it's impossible to put cameras inside those dens. So we really have a really poor understanding of what's going on in there. So whether a female goes in as a pregnant female, does she have enough fat on her body to sustain those cubs long enough to come out of the den? What does that behavior look like in the den, and how does different body condition as it relates to getting enough seals before she gets in the den? How does that relate to the quality of her maternal care? And what does that mean for the survival of the cubs? So it's a really underexplored area of polar bear biology.
Wow. Jeff?
For me, one of the questions I'd like answered is the closing of information gaps. Basically, when you look at a map of what we geographically know about polar bears, and this has changed in the last decade, but we had a lot of question marks, a lot of areas that were sort of black holes of information. Canada and Greenland have stepped up their efforts to fill those gaps, and we still have quite a few along the Russian Arctic coast. So I'd like to help be a part of filling in some of those information gaps so we have a better understanding of what's happening to polar bears throughout their range.
Wow. Andy, what keeps you up at night?
Well, there's lots of things that keep me up at night, but I think the number one issue that I think we really have to consider is, and one of the things that drives a lot of our research, is answering the question of how much sea ice do polar bears really need?
Right.
And so we can measure that in different ways, but one of the key parameters is how many days of ice in a year do they need to survive in an area. And so right now these bears have been off the ice for about 141 days. We're pretty sure that that's not a problem for them. They can probably go 150, 160. From our energetics analysis, working with the data from zoos and from our satellite telemetry collars, we can say that at 180 days, we're going to see major problems. This year, it's not bad for the bears, but we're getting close to that some years here, and that's a threshold where we'll start to see increases in starvation in the population. So how much ice is the question?
Yeah. Well, one of the questions that just came in is people want to know, how are the bears in the western Hudson Bay area, how's their population being affected as opposed to bears in more northern areas?
Well, we've got 19 different populations of polar bears around the Arctic, and we've got 19 different scenarios playing out over time. Some populations are losing ice a lot faster than others. This area is kind of intermediate. We've had a long history of ice loss here, so the period of ice cover is shorter. And one of the consequences of that is that the bears are smaller here. They don't grow as big as they used to be. They're not as fat as they used to be. And the females are giving birth to fewer cubs, and fewer of those cubs are surviving. And when you put that all together, what we've got is a declining population size in this area. We're down over 30% in abundance in the last 20 years. So we used to have 1,200, now we're under 800 bears in this area. And again, some populations, though, are doing quite fine right now. So the population straight north of us is fine. There's still about 2,500 bears up there, and it has been for quite a while. But that's because the sea ice hasn't changed yet. Once the ice starts to change, and we're starting to see that beginning point, we can imagine that population will decline as well.
Got it. Another question just came in is, what further research is needed, and how does it relate to conservation management decisions?
I think one of the most pressing questions is really understanding what's going on for polar bears in whole parts of the Arctic that we have really no good data on population numbers. Something we talk about all the time. In this population here on the Hudson Bay, these bears have been well studied by Andy and his colleagues for the past 30 plus years. So we really understand how the sea ice changes are driving these declines in the population. For great areas of the Arctic, we just don't know.
Yeah.
And what this is going to take is scientific innovation, technological innovation, and getting more people interested in becoming wildlife biologists. And with that understanding, I think we'll better be able to manage polar bears around the Arctic.
Got it. I took a few questions. People knew I was coming up here, and they said, "Oh, you're going to have access to these scientists." The number one question everyone wanted answers: what do we know about this talk of a polar grizzly hybrid?
Oh yeah, that's a fun one.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing here is polar bears evolved from a grizzly bear or a brown bear ancestor, and so genetically they're quite similar. We've known for decades that they can hybridize in captivity. So if you put a grizzly bear and a polar bear together, they can have cubs, and those offspring are fertile. But of course, this was ignited recently in the 2000s when there was a hybrid grizzly bear, polar bear shot in the Canadian Arctic, and there was a lot of interest about this. Oh, it's climate change, or the problem is we don't really know why it happened. But grizzly bears have been expanding northward into polar bear habitat, and what happens there is it's usually the males are the ones that disperse. They leave where they're born and they go farther away, and so some of those bears go north, south, east, and west. And the ones that went north got up there, and there's no girl polar bears hanging around, and you get lonely in the Arctic, and love is blind, and they are out traveling around over the ice, and they smell female polar bear, and it smells just fine, and so they track out that individual, and then of course mating activity happens, and we get these half grizzly bear, half polar bears. Now we have seen a fair number of them, but less than 10. But if we roll back in time 100,000 years or more,
Yeah.
we know that there were other events like that. We can see it in the genetics of polar bears and grizzly bears that these species have come together over time. And so it is not uncommon to have hybrids in wildlife. We see it with bobcat and lynx and wolves and coyotes, so it's not totally uncommon.
Amazing. Yeah, so it's we got more questions coming in, and looking forward, what would you guys like to do in the next few years? I mean, like I said, you've been just constantly on this constant rise and getting all this information, doing great things with Polar Bears National. What are some of the bigger plans with the research we're going to be seeing in the next 5-10 years?
Another big challenge that we haven't spoken that much about in this session is that with more polar bears coming on land, there is increasing potential for conflict with human communities. And so we're really looking to develop, again, that deeper understanding of polar bears so that we can manage those interactions better. And so that on top of understanding polar bears and their behavior and how they respond to human communities, we also want to develop technological solutions for early detection so that a community can understand when a polar bear is coming their way and change their behavior to accommodate that passing polar bear. I know Polar Bears International is working on some really interesting technology that's going to help communities with that. Jeff, I don't know if you want to speak to that a bit more.
Yeah, like Megan said, a concern around the Arctic is more polar bears spending more time on shore and for longer periods of time, and that just is setting up a perfect opportunity for them to get in trouble with people, with us. And so we're looking at both low-tech and high-tech solutions. One we're testing here in Churchill right now is one we call our RF Spotter project. It's using a ground-based radar system. It's military technology that's used to kind of do perimeter control at a forward operating base. We're trying to use it for forward control of polar bears coming into communities like Churchill. Right now it's mounted on the Tundra Buggy Lodge that we stay out here, and we're testing its ability to detect polar bears. If it's proven effective, which it looks like it has been quite effective, we can also look at its ability to automatically trigger some deterrences. So you can imagine around a community like Churchill, it's surrounded by 800 some polar bears during the season, having something that automatically is looking at night in a snowstorm for bears that are coming in, along with people that are also doing, playing a role in that detection. It'll be a really nice setup.
Wow. And like I said, we have a lot of young, blooming minds out there watching today. For those young folks who think this might be a field they might want to go into, what are some of the joys of being a polar bear field scientist?
Well, it's interesting. You'll never be bored. You're not going to get rich, unfortunately, but it's a fascinating career. If you like to be outside, if you like animals, if you want to try to help the planet, any of those are good motivators to being in this business. But what I'll tell you, if you're in school now, work hard, study hard, and learn a lot, because it's a process and it takes a long time to get through your elementary school and your high school, and then usually many degrees at a university. So, but it's a fascinating trip, and I wouldn't change it for anything.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Another thing that I think is really important to being a scientist is being creative. So you're confronted with all these problems, and sometimes there's a really clear solution. You can draw on your scientific tools to work towards that solution. But it really requires thinking outside the box quite a bit. So that creativity is really important. Another thing that's really important is listening and being willing to collaborate. And so listening to your colleagues, listening to people's thoughts from outside your typical community, that can really provide you with insights that can drive you towards a solution.
Yeah, and it's not one particular thing, too. I think used to be, and maybe a lot of people still think this way, it's people like me that enjoy being in nature, enjoy being in cold places like this, enjoy wildlife. But today, to solve the problems that are facing us, we need engineers, we need chemists, we need geneticists, we need technologists, we need programmers. We need all of these skill sets that aren't biology, but to work together in a cross-disciplinary fashion to really answer the questions that are most pressing right now.
One thing I'll say from this experience is that, yesterday we traveled all day in the buggy, and then at night we linked up to a larger set of buggies where we slept. And so to me it was the closest feeling to being on another planet or kind of docking with a space station. We don't get off the buggy and walk around the tundra because we don't want to have any negative interactions with the bears, and we don't want to harm the environment. So it is this sense of almost being on another planet. So I think if you are interested in being an astronaut, this is a good place to start. So anything else you'd like to add, just for our audience who might want to take action, who might know, hey, I know there's a problem, how can I help?
Well, I think our staff scientist, Elisa McCall, can do that for us.
Great. Wonderful.
Outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.
And we can work together to reduce CO2, save energy, influence where energy comes from. Now, if you're a student or a teacher, please visit the Get Involved section of our website for materials on how to bring about change in our communities. And finally, please consider completing the evaluation with your class. It is at the bottom of the screen and will be emailed you if you've registered. We've also posted the link in our chat window, so participants will be able to, participants who have entered the drawing, there will be one later, and one of 3 polar bear cubs adoptions will be done. So thank you to our sponsors and our panelists, and thank you for supporting polar bears. And one other exciting and interactive initiative we do have is Polar Bear Cam Bingo. So there's actually 5 cameras out there right now that are live 24 hours a day, and most of the time when you tune in, you're going to see polar bear engaging in some form of activity. So if you go to explore.org/polar/bear/bingo, once again, that's explore.org/polar/bear/bingo, there's an actual bingo card. And you can tune into the cameras, and when you see it happening, if you see a polar bear doing yoga, or 2 of them sparring, or a mother and her cub, you do a screen grab, and then you fill out your bingo card. And if you get 3 in a row, you'll actually win a prize. So once again, thank you so much, guys. And once again, this will be saved right on the website. So if you didn't get to watch the whole thing now, you can watch it more later. So thank you again, and we'll be having more webcasts shortly.
The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.